Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Michael Campbell was 9 years old when God tried to take music away. That was, at least, how some in the village had seen it. Others, like his father, saw it differently. Sat at the kitchen table, thin strings pinched between his thick fingers, the ends curling in the soft morning light, his father told Michael that music was the heart of their culture and the soul of their expression. And besides, if God didn't want them to dance and drink and make damned fools of themselves, he never would have gifted them with the divine inspiration for the fiddle. The impetus to silence the parish, he explained, belonged not to God, but to one misguided man who had swept across the west coast like a sweat wind or the great flood in the Bible, bent on extinguishing the fire that burned in the belly of every fiddler on Cape Breton Island. You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. Music is a huge part of who we are. It sets the tone and the tempo for a fun night and an easy morning. It has the remarkable, unexplainable ability to affect us emotionally, spiritually, and physiologically. It can make us laugh and cry. It can quicken our pace and help us sit still and focus. Music is also an essential aspect of every culture on the planet, and each body of work carries with it a history and a sense of identity all its own. As musician Jack White writes, quote, "The melody of the human race is a song that never ends. Music is sacred," end quote. Tonight, I have a legend for you about when one of those melodies was nearly stopped by a single man who believed he was following his sacred duty, and the musicians who fought to keep the music alive. This is the legend of the Fiddle-Burning priest of Cape Breton Island. Part 1. Instruments and Infernos. When he closes his eyes and tries to remember, the images he sees are like a magic lantern show, part memory, part dream. The day began with a warning. It was a brisk autumn morning, and somehow a wren had found its way inside his house. And Michael, broom in hand, tried his best to shoo it outside. The bird evaded his every effort, diving and darting below and above the child's clumsy swings. The first few attempts did nothing but send a half-dozen bristles sailing through the air, and the wren chattering across the room to safety. When he thought he had it cornered in the kitchen, a poorly aimed swipe brought a set of tin cups clattering to the floor, narrowly missing the bread dough that his mother had left to rise near the oven. Michael turned to face his adversary and spotted the wren perched atop the scroll of his father's fiddle, sitting on a chair by the fireplace. Afraid he might damage the instrument, he leaned his broom against the kitchen counter, slipped his jacket from the back of a chair, and crept towards the hearth. When he came too close and the bird took flight, he snapped the jacket open, blocking its escape back to the kitchen. It arced toward the open front door, and Michael and his jacket followed. With one final flap of its wings, the wren swept through the doorway, just missing his mother, who had returned from a visit to the neighbors. She watched with surprise as the bird bobbed over the house and disappeared, then turned to Michael with concern in her eyes. How many legs did it have? The boy was taken aback by the question. He knew the superstition, of course. A wild bird in the house was bad luck, doubly so if it was one-legged. But he had been so fixated on removing it from their home that he had neglected to note that crucial detail. He shrugged. "I couldn't tell. I'm sorry." His mother crossed herself and picked the cups off the floor. "Your father's in town," she said. Her voice quavered. Let's pray he makes it home safely." Michael nodded, then went over to his father's fiddle where a single downy feather lay across the strings. Acting on instinct, he carried the instrument to the closet beneath the stairs and placed it inside, then plucked the feather from the neck, brought it to the open doorway, and shook it into the wind. He watched its fragile form twirl away and disappear. Then he shut the door. The bread was fully baked, the cookpot was bubbling, and the sky was a soft purple by the time his father came home, healthy and happily unaware of any misfortune that the wren's appearance may have foretold. Michael told him of the bird and how he had stored the fiddle beneath the stairs. His father smiled reassuringly. His safe return suggested that the bird must have been fully intact, so whatever trouble was about to befall them would not, at least, be fatal. The trouble finally made itself known shortly after 6 o'clock, with 4 sharp raps at the front door. There was a moment of uncertain silence as the boy's mother and father looked at each other. Then Michael watched from the fireside as his mother rose from the table and opened the door. The thin, angular frame of Father Kenneth MacDonald was behind it. Dressed in his cassock, he looked like a living shadow, and though he was slight in build, the way the black wool hung from his square shoulders and his pale face bent past the threshold, it seemed as if he filled the entire doorway, as if night itself had come calling. Though Michael couldn't hear his exact words, the sound of the priest's voice made clear that this wasn't a social call. It was the same voice he used during Mass, one of power and authority, delivered with a cold smile and a stern hand. He dipped his head a little and gazed into the room. Their eyes met, and the boy felt compelled to look away. "Please, come in," his mother offered, stepping aside. The night detached itself from the priest's shoulders, and he floated inside the room. The floorboards creaked as he walked to the head of the table and sat down. From his place by the fire, Michael couldn't hear the adults' quiet conversation, so he watched them instead. Watched how his mother placed her hands in her lap, how his father leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms while nodding his head, and how Reverend MacDonald sat with his back straight, his arms wide on the table, hands gesturing as he spoke. After what seemed like an eternity, his father called him over. The priest's eyes glowed in the firelight like 2 distant stars as he watched the boy approach. "Michael," his father said, "go fetch my fiddle for the maester. It's under the bed." The child stood still for a moment, trying to process the request. His father's instructions didn't make any sense. The instrument was always kept in the front room, and he had told his father that he had tucked it away under the stairs. "Hurry now," his father urged. The boy turned and dutifully sauntered toward the bedroom, uncertain whether he should remind his father of their earlier conversation. Sensing his son's hesitation, the man turned back to the priest and spoke loud enough for his son to hear. "I'll sure miss it, Father. It's the fiddle I played at my brother-in-law's wedding. I'm awfully sentimental about it, but if it's for the good of the community, then you should take it." Suddenly, Michael understood. He had forgotten that there was a second, older fiddle with a fiery red varnish that his father had played when Michael was still in swaddling cloth. He remembered the story of his uncle's wedding, how his father was there with other musicians from the village, Joe Ritchie and Harold Anderson, how there was a lot of dancing and a lot of drinking, how a fight broke out, and how a jolt of reflexes and a misplaced punch or two had cracked the lower bout and damaged the bridge of his father's fiddle. Some quick repair work made it playable, but its sound was never the same. After he sobered up, the man who caused the damage gave him a new, better fiddle, and the red beauty was laid to rest beneath the bed, set to be Michael's practice fiddle once he was old enough to play. As he delivered it to the priest, he somehow realized that he would never see it again. "Thank you, my boy," the priest said, stroking the fiddle with his hand. He looked across the table. "Just the one?" Michael's father nodded. The priest looked at Michael, then at the father, and, deciding he was satisfied, rose to his feet. "Good. I promise. The village will be better off now that this instrument of the devil is in the hands of the church. Now I must be going. I'm afraid I've taken too much of your time already." Michael's father held the door as Reverend MacDonald stepped back into the night. "See you on Sunday," he smiled. Michael stood by his father as they watched the priest walk to a wheelbarrow he had left by the side of the road, and they could see that the priest had collected other instruments in addition to their own. The neck of a different fiddle and the chanter of a bagpipe poked above the rim and shone in the moonlight. The priest placed the red fiddle inside, then grasped both handles and began to walk slowly down the road. The wheel squeaked as it rolled. His father went to the kitchen and wrapped the freshly baked bread in a dishcloth. "Go to the Ritchie's house," he told Michael, handing him the package. "Let them know that Father Kenneth is coming to take their fiddles. Use the back door. If he sees you, just tell him the bread is a gift for the family. Go." Outside, Michael hurried to get ahead of the squeaking that echoed through the spaces between the houses. But just before he reached the Ritchie's house, he noticed that the sound was getting fainter, even as he slowed. It seemed that Reverend MacDonald had already been to that end of the village and was heading home. Michael knew that he should have stopped there, that he should have turned back and gone home. But he couldn't. He had to know, had to see what the maester was up to. He followed the sound of the squealing wheel along a route he had taken hundreds of times on Sunday mornings, but it was now strange and transformed in the moonlight. He comforted himself by imagining that it was Christmas and he was on his way to midnight mass. The noise had stopped by the time the church steeple rose into view and the rectory was dark. The moon glinted off the window panes. Michael wondered if the priest had taken an unexpected turn when a sudden shadow flitted past a window. The boy crept around the building and saw the wheelbarrow sitting half empty by the porch. A moment later, the priest appeared from the dark of the house, gathered the rest of the instruments from the barrow, and went back inside. The door banged shut behind him, and the force left it slightly ajar. Placing his palm on the weathered wood, he carefully pushed it open until he could see the black form of Kenneth MacDonald kneeling by the hearth. Moments later, the darkness of the room began to shift in the light of a newborn fire. The priest stood, and they both watched the fingers of flame explore the block of wood. When it was established, he grabbed a fiddle from a pile on the table and shoved it into the fire. Michael watched helplessly as blazing tendrils wrapped around its contours and multiplied. Orange waves of light poured from the fireplace and lapped up the walls as another fiddle was added, then another, using a bow to stoke the fire until it grew into an inferno so strong that Michael could almost feel the heat through the door. With the fireplace full, Reverend MacDonald paused for a moment, and Michael saw that his father's old fiddle, his fiddle, was in the priest's hands. And then the priest did something unexpected. He studied it, plucked a string with his finger, then raised the instrument to his chin and began to play a slow, sad song. The sweet sound of the strings wafted through the air like the ashes of their instruments, billowed from the home like the plumes of gray smoke that twisted from the cremated remains of their music, out through the stone chimney and up into heaven. Michael placed the bread on the porch and inched closer, but a misplaced hand made the door creak inward. Moments later, feeling the chill night air at his back, the father stopped playing and looked with suspicion to the open door and found it empty, except for a loaf of bread lying forgotten just beyond the firelight. In his mind, it was a fitting tribute offered anonymously from a thankful member of his flock. He quietly recited choice parts of the Lord's Prayer as he placed another fiddle on the fire. "Give us this day our daily bread, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." As he ran home, Michael had a very different interpretation. Reverend MacDonald was not trying to save them from evil, but to deprive them of their voice. And if there was no music in heaven, well, he had no interest in going. Part 2. The Devil of Cape Breton Island. The Reverend Kenneth J. MacDonald is an infamous figure in the history of Cape Breton Island. Yes, he was a real person, so it's important to note that the story you just heard is based not on the man himself, but the legend that he became. The stories that, over the course of a century, became entwined with the folklore of the region and earned him the infamous title of the Fiddle-Burning Priest of Mabu. As for the man himself, I'm sure that when he wasn't confiscating people's private property and burning it, he was a sweetheart. Well, maybe not. Born at South River, Antigonish County in 1821, Kenneth MacDonald received an above-average education before joining the Catholic Church. He was ordained in 1856, due, at least in part, to the scarcity of priests. He took to his new vocation like, well, a flame to a fiddle, working in several parishes throughout Nova Scotia before being appointed to Mabu, Inverness County in 1865. There, he helped to build some of the region's first schools and later a convent which he paid for with his own money. Father Kenneth, or Meester Coinach, as he was known to the mostly Gaelic-speaking locals, quickly earned a reputation for his sincere and tireless work preaching the Word of God, teaching the catechism, encouraging education, and bringing comfort to the sick. He was, as one historian put it, an eminently good and zealous priest, which is one of the few times I've ever heard the word zealous used in a positive light. According to The Casket, a local Catholic newspaper, he was a holy priest who loved the people of Mabu and cultivated in them, quote, the virtues of honesty, industry, and sobriety, thus ensuring their success in this life and their eternal happiness in the next, end quote. Not everyone agreed with that assessment. When speaking of Father Kenneth, some who lived in the parish described him as a pious, intense, physically powerful, and quote-unquote hellish man who dictated how they should act, speak, and even vote. As researcher Daniel William McInnes put it, the predominant emotion he evoked was fear. Most settlers on the island were poor, illiterate Scottish exiles who were either forced from their Highland homes or left the old country on their own volition to escape crippling poverty, starvation, and persecution, and to embrace new opportunities across the Atlantic. They had little in physical possessions, but they brought along their culture, their language, their beliefs, their customs, and their music. It was those last two that were the most problematic for the priest because they played the biggest role in weddings, celebrations, and that most scandalous and debaucherous of activities, the dreaded Sunday picnic. It sounds silly, but it's true. The man hated picnics because, though the idea of a picnic seems innocent today, back then it was a rare excuse for people to come together, crack open a few bottles of liquor, and before they knew it, they'd be within the devil's grasp. Literally, if you believe the regional folklore. There's a great story shared by a man named Dan McNeil in the book Cape Breton, Book of the Night that takes place after a wedding on a fog-filled night in 1928. It's late, and Dan has had one hell of a night. "She was pretty bad there, boy," he tells us. "They used to fight like cats and dogs. Yes, those days, dances and liquor, boy, they'd fight like cats and dogs. They were monsters. They were big men, boy. They'd fight. There'd be blood flying all over, and I left there. It was dark as the devil in hell, and I guess it was the devil that I met, too." As Dan walks down the dark street, away from the wedding and toward the safety and sanity of his home, he reaches a hill. He has just started to climb it when he hears the sound of something approaching. He can't see a thing in all that darkness, but he assumes it's a sheep. They were all over the road back then, and he can hear the sound of its hooves moving in the dirt. He keeps climbing, and when the creature comes within about 10 or 12 feet of Dan, it suddenly slides right into him, blocking his way. It doesn't push him or paw at him, it just sort of sits there and lets out a quiet bleat. Definitely a sheep. Or so he thought at first. Dan moves around the strange animal and keeps climbing. When he gets about halfway to the top, this thing suddenly comes towards him again. He can hear it moving slowly down the hill, and when it comes within about 7 or 8 feet, it suddenly slides into him, right along the ground, and again lets out a quiet bah. At the top of the hill, Dan and the creature collide for a third time, and now Dan has had enough. He realizes that this creature that keeps sliding into him, as if to impede his progress, is not a simple sheep. It's the devil himself that's trying to nudge him back to the party, back to the drinking, dancing, and fighting. Dan gets mad. "You fly to hell, you son of a bitch," he yells at the darkness, and proceeds to call this strange, bleating creature every curse word he knows. "You go straight to hell if it's you." No sooner did he utter those words that the entire cove came alive with an overwhelming sound of unseen shapes barreling through fences and crashing into the forest. Dan pulled a rosary from his pocket and blessed himself, then continued on his way. "I'm pretty sure it was the devil," he told his interviewer. "It wasn't a sheep. It was trying to take me back to the dance. I didn't see anything, but whatever it was, I'm pretty sure it was him. Nobody else. I told that to lots of people, and they say, 'You're right, it was him, boy, trying to send you back over there. There may have been trouble if I went back.'" He wasn't kidding. If you know your folklore or just listen to other episodes of Fireside Canada, you know that the devil is reputedly fond of crashing parties. In Cape Breton, folks once told stories about the night a bodchan paid a visit to a group of teens in Middle River, about 70 kilometers east of Mabu. And what is a bodchan? According to a folklore sampler from the Maritimes, it's a Gaelic term, quote, "which seems to mean an offshoot of Satan," end quote. I suspect the word is a variant of bodach, literally old man, which is a sort of ancient Gaelic boogeyman associated with the Celtic underworld, who, in Scotland, sometimes comes down the chimney to kidnap naughty children. That fateful night in Middle River, however, he came through the front door with a fiddle in his hand. The story goes that the youth of the area had gathered for a house party, but the fiddler failed to show. After nearly an hour of waiting and a few rounds of moonshine, one of the boys uttered these regrettable words: "I wish to the devil we had some music here." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door, and the unfortunate youths opened it to find a middle-aged man standing and smiling with a fiddle under his arm. He wasn't from the region, that much was clear, but he knew how to play, and that was enough. They welcomed him inside, and after taking a few shots of their liquor, he began to play. Oh, he was good. He was very good. Maybe the best they had heard in their short lives. And they were loving it, crowded onto the dance floor, kicking up their feet to reel after reel, each one faster than the one before. Until one of the younger girls who was watching from the sidelines noticed something strange about the old fellow. After the third set, she called her older sister from the dance floor and whispered, "He has a funny foot on him." The sister turned her head, and her jaw dropped open in horror as she saw that the stranger had a cloven hoof. The boy had wished the devil for some music, and the devil, being the devil, was all too happy to oblige. A murmur of worried whispers spread throughout the party until one of the bolder, more righteous partygoers stepped up to lead his fellow youth in the singing of hymns. Their voices rose slowly as one, drowning out the old man's music, and as they sang louder and louder, a fiery light rose from the center of the violin, glowing brighter and brighter until the music stopped. With a burst of blasphemy, the infernal fiddler hit the wall and disappeared, leaving a single handprint burned into the wood. The dead and the damned seem just as fond of the fiddle as the lost and the living. In another story from the surrounding region, the devil once appeared on Halloween night on the property of a well-respected merchant. Perched in an apple tree, he was playing the fiddle as hard as he could, while a recently deceased thief and her unscrupulous lawyers danced in the moonlight. I could go on, but the key takeaway is that on Cape Breton Island, many were taught to fear the unholy power of a good tune and a willingness to dance. But if we're being honest, alcohol was the real problem. People would go to gatherings, knock back a few too many, and suddenly be carousing, fighting, and maybe even dying if the weather was cold and they wandered too far the wrong way. At first, the maester preached abstinence, and when that didn't work, he tried to physically intercept the backyard moonshiners, whom he called agents of Satan, that supplied Cape Bretoners with their demon drink. A man known as Archie Campbell was one of those moonshiners, and one of the most famous. Archie came from a long line of whiskey makers back in his native Scotland, and his entire family were known as the Brewers. He came to Mabu when he was just 7 years old, and when he grew up, he took over the family business. Residents would reap their barley in the autumn and bring their crop to the brewers. By Christmas, he would have kegs of shine waiting for pickup and ready to fuel the traditional 15 days of holiday cheer. A popular legend tells us that one day, shortly after Father Kenneth came to Mabu, the priest was standing on the glebe when he saw and heard old Brewer Campbell rattling by on his wagon, moonshine bottles clinking away in the back. Father Kenneth asked one of his parishioners who the man was, and when he heard the name Brewer, he leapt up to stop the wagon. Foregoing introductions, the priest asked Archie flat out in Gaelic, "Are you making any of that evil stuff?" The brewer smiled and shook his head. "Oh no," he said, "only a little bit of that Garav Guchkak." Father Kenneth didn't know what that was, but it sounded innocent enough, and few people would dare lie to a priest, so he let Archie continue on his way, not realizing that Garav Guchkak was a Gaelic distiller's term for foreshot, or literally rough drops, which is the thin layer of methanol and acetone that develops on the surface of a newly distilled whiskey. Normally, you throw out the foreshot as it contains all the poisonous stuff that you don't want to drink, but because its existence atop your liquor indicates a particularly high proof, the term became a metonym for top-shelf moonshine. So, in a way, Archie didn't exactly lie to the maester. He certainly wasn't making any of that evil stuff, just the highest quality hooch that could be found on Cape Breton Island. A short time later, it was announced that the bishop would be making a rare visit to Mabu, and all the parishioners were encouraged to attend. But on the day of the event, the bishop was running late, and some in the welcoming party decided to pass around a bottle of the good stuff while they waited, and waited. Finally, the bishop arrived with Father Kenneth leading the way, and everyone sprang to their feet. Everyone, that is, except for Archie the brewer. He was so drunk he couldn't stand up, so he decided to remain on his knees and try to keep the world from spinning. The bishop was so impressed with this apparent display of piety and respect that he gave the drunken brewer an individual blessing, while the rest in the crowd had to be content with a general benediction. That was another win for Archie. Somewhere along the way, Father Kenneth must have decided that it was impossible to completely ban alcohol. So he stepped back and looked at the bigger picture. Where there was music, there was a crowd, which led to dancing and drinking and ultimately humankind's ruination. But if you stopped the music, you would stop the party before it even began. So that's what he did, in an act that would become legend. It's unclear just how destructive or successful he was, but it happened, there's no doubt about that. There are plenty of recollections of how Father Kenneth attempted to, as one writer put it, quell the demoniacal atmosphere which had fallen over the people of Cape Breton Island by seizing, smashing, and burning every fiddle and pipe he could find. Apparently, more than a few clever musicians gave the priest their old, worn-out fiddles and kept their good ones stashed away in some secret hiding place. Exactly how many instruments succumbed to the father's fire, we don't know. Some said he went door to door gathering all that he could find. Others, like scholar Marie Thompson, tells us that only a few fiddlers handed over their instruments. While most people believe he set fire to them, some suggested that he was, in fact, a fiddle player as well, and may have kept the best instruments for himself. We also don't know if he burned bagpipes as well, or if that was just a rumor. Around the same time, Highlanders in Scotland were apparently facing cultural persecution and having their pipes burned, so the accusation may have been unjustly applied to Father Kenneth. What is clear, however, is the impact he had on the community as the fiddle-burning priest of Mabu. In 1986, the local Catholic Church decided to host a dance at the church hall, where liquor would be served. During the church service announcement, the priest at the time joked that, quote, Father Kenneth would roll over in his grave if he heard this, end quote. Many nodded their heads in agreement, familiar with the legend, despite the fact that Father Kenneth had died nearly 8 decades prior. So why did these stories have such a big impact? Father Kenneth helped to educate the people and built a convent at his own expense, yet the fiddle burning became his lasting legacy. Why? Well, it has to do with the culture of Cape Breton Island, and more generally, of Canada itself. Part 3. An Island of Fiddlers. The violin might be one of the most Canadian of musical instruments. It's remarkably diverse, at home in the most refined of classical music, as well as the most spirited of folk songs. Small, light, and easy to pack, it was one of the few possessions to accompany early immigrants across the Atlantic from places like France, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Germany, and later Ukraine, Poland, and Romania. Loved by rich and poor alike, you could find them in every corner of the country, in nearly every farmhouse, alehouse, bunkhouse, brickhouse, and townhouse. But, as so often happens in a culture, it was the working class who really made it their own. Sure, the wealthy dutifully learned the violin, memorized and practiced the greatest works of Vivaldi, Bach, and Mozart, but it was the poorer folks who played the fiddle, who improvised and invented, and made the instrument and the music their own. Here, in their new home, the classic traditions of the old countries mixed with the musical stylings of settler and indigenous cultures, producing new and distinct music that are still recognized today. There are, according to experts, about a dozen different styles specific to Canada. Styles like West Coast, Prairie, Ottawa Valley, and Down East. These styles, in turn, are part of 4 distinct fiddle traditions: Old Time, French Canadian, Métis, and the star of this episode, Cape Breton. A lively, richly embellished sound with its roots deeply planted in the Scottish Highlands, and its form firmly inspired by the inflection of Gaelic speech, danceable rhythms, and the bright, evocative sound of the bagpipe. According to Alistair McGillivray's book, The Cape Breton Fiddler, the first shipload of Scottish Highlanders arrived in Pictou, Nova Scotia in September of 1773, following the notorious Highland clearances, where many poor families were forced from their home by wealthy landowners. By 1851, about 55,000 emigrants had come to Nova Scotia, and 12,000 of those were Scots who decided to settle on Cape Breton Island. Parts of this island, he writes, became reconstructions of entire districts in Scotland. Many had lost their Highland home, but here in Nova Scotia, or New Scotland, they had a chance to start again, using a shared culture as a cornerstone. Life was difficult. People felt isolated and alone, and the rugged island offered little in the way of material comfort. So the settlers relied on their Gaelic oral traditions to not just entertain, but create a sense of community and of place. There was comfort and companionship to be found in their shared language of Gaelic, and their voices, bagpipes, and violins. Especially on the darkest nights of winter, when the fires seemed to burn exceptionally bright. Their music served as a salve during hard times, and soon you couldn't call yourself a real settlement unless you had a resident piper and fiddler. And you couldn't have a wedding, ceilidh, or kitchen party without one or both present. Over time, bagpipes became somewhat rare. Like pianos, they were complicated to make and expensive to buy. Fiddles filled the gap because they were comparatively easy to make. Just carve a piece of nearby wood. The music spread to other settlements as well, to the French and the Mi'kmaq, and they added their own fiddlers with their own distinct voices to a growing chorus of master musicians and hometown heroes. Within short order, Cape Breton Island proudly earned the reputation and the identity as an island of fiddlers. Father MacDonald and others like him failed to understand the power and importance of that fact. They couldn't shake the old world belief that fiddles were the instruments of the devil, directly tied to the evils of excessive drinking and the sex and violence that, in their minds, usually followed. They didn't realize that denying people their music was akin to denying them their language. Actually, it was worse than that because, like Gaelic, fiddle music is part of Cape Breton's rich heritage. It's not static. It's dynamic and developing, part of a living culture. For many Cape Bretoners, to fight against the attempted fiddle ban was to fight for nothing less than their own identity, a fight they knew all too well. Hundreds of years earlier, in the early 16th century, their Highland ancestors also had their fiddles burned, broken, or seized by the church shortly after the Reformation. Then further repression, the breakup of the time-honored clan system, and the destruction and fragmentation of communities during the Highland clearances had threatened to destroy their culture. In fact, it's said that certain tunes and distinct qualities of Scottish Highland fiddle music were lost over the centuries and are no longer found in Europe. They would have disappeared entirely were it not for the passionate musicians of Scottish descent who kept the traditions alive within those isolated pockets on Cape Breton Island. You can see then why Father MacDonald's failure to silence the music became a point of pride for the people of Mabou and Greater Cape Breton Island. In January of 1972, the CBC aired a short documentary titled Vanishing Cape Breton Fiddler. Written by freelance journalist Ronald McGuinness and produced and directed by Charles Reynolds, it came with a dire warning of impending cultural atrophy. Scottish-style fiddle music, long a part of Cape Breton's cultural identity, was dying. The kids of the 60s and 70s were leaving the island in droves and abandoning the traditional fiddle music for the siren song of modern rock and roll. It was quite the claim, especially considering it was the first time, according to Marie Thompson, that anyone had officially named the music in question as solely Cape Breton music. In just 30 minutes and before thousands of viewers, the CBC had revealed the existence of a distinct Cape Breton sound, and then, in their next breath, delivered its eulogy. But was the music truly disappearing? According to the myth of the vanishing Cape Breton fiddler, that message was considered somewhat inflammatory, but it served to light a fire under many in the community. Community leaders began to argue that the music was alive and well. Fiddling associations were formed. Young people were strongly encouraged to take up the bow and learn from their elders. The fiddling tradition of Cape Breton Island was given a greater sense of respect and importance than it ever enjoyed in the past, and the following year, the first in a series of festivals was held to celebrate the island, its people, and their music. Suddenly, the once threatened art form of the Cape Breton fiddler experienced a revival. And with that revival came stories, old and new, of community empowerment and resilience. In her essay, The Fiddle-Burning Priest of Mabou, scholar Jody McDavid writes, quote, "When I first moved to Cape Breton, time and again, I was presented with one kernel narrative. We had a priest here that burned our fiddles. It became clear to me that locals wanted to tell the story of this priest, had told it before, and had told it so often that, for them, it needed little contextualizing," end quote. Local musician Willie Kennedy briefly touches on the story in the liner notes of Cape Breton Violin, noting it as a proud point in the island's history of the local musicians doing what they could to keep their music alive, and eventually standing up for themselves. There's no doubt that Father Kenneth MacDonald did a lot of good for his community and was loved by many, in spite of the beef he had with the region's music. And his attack on Cape Breton musical culture, as one student put it, seemed to be more an exception than a rule for the church. Thompson reassures us that many Cape Breton priests were proficient fiddlers and dancers, and that by the mid-20th century, local Catholic leaders actively encouraged fiddle music and dancing at their summer picnics. Yet, for right or wrong, Father Kenneth's name became associated with the notion of misguided cultural warfare. He grew to be the villain who hoarded violins like a dragon hoards treasure, or smashed or burned every fiddle he could find like a fascist burning books, until the common people found the courage and conviction to stand up to the tyrant and push back. These kinds of stories are universal and can be found in folklore and history across the globe, where unjust authority figures choose to attack their targets indirectly, focusing on the perceived unsavory elements of a specific culture rather than the individuals of an entire community. Here in Canada, where we've enjoyed a relatively peaceful and arguably progressive existence for much of the country's young life, larger examples of overstepping authorities are far too common. One of the most obvious and egregious, of course, is the notorious Indian Act, with its ban of sun dances and potlatches and its creation of residential schools, which were designed, in the words of Sir John A. MacDonald, to, quote, take the Indian out of the child, end quote. But other smaller examples are out there as well. In 1912, for example, the Ontario government banned the French language in Francophone schools. And if these kinds of laws seem like a thing of the distant past, consider this. As recently as the 1970s, the city of Vancouver, BC, tried to ban barbecued meat, of all things, in what is now widely regarded as an overt act of racism. Chinatown merchants, business owners, and other allies had to band together and fight back, going so far as sending a delegation to Ottawa to serve delicious barbecued pork to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the rest of Parliament. Eventually, the city's health department backed down, and barbecued meat thankfully remains on the menu. I imagine that if the person who started it all had been a popular politician or community leader rather than a faceless bureaucrat, I'd be telling you the legend not of the priest who detested violins, but of the villainous health inspector who had a seething hatred for delicious Cantonese-style duck. The point is, stories like the Fiddle-Burning priest endure because people in positions of power continue to cross the line in their quest for control. And we sometimes need to be reminded that it's not those in power, but the people who make a community and a culture. If we want them to survive, it's up to each one of us to work together to honor, preserve, record, and share our cultures through art, music, and, of course, through story. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and for joining me in becoming part of a Canadian folk tradition. Now that you know the story, share it. And remember to be yourself. Tell your stories and play your music loud and proud. Fireside Canada is written and recorded by me, David Williams, with sound design by Matt Kesselman. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our business manager. Jordan Heath Rawlings is our executive producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving this podcast a positive review. If you want to help even further, you can provide story ideas and more through my website. Every little bit helps to keep the fire burning and the Library of Legends growing. Learn more at firesidecanada.ca.